It's my great pleasure to introduce Surili Patel. She is the Deputy Director of Public Health Policy at the American Public Health Association, where she leads APHA's new Center on Climate, Health, and Equity. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Is it still morning? Thank you for the invitation to be here. This is a beautiful room filled with, from the conversations I've had, some really passionate people. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to start off with a bit of a story, which is a riff off of a parable that we all know from our childhood. And it's set in a city, similar to New York. And there's a picture. And it starts on the 5th day of a heat wave. And all of a sudden, there erupts a wildfire, somewhere far away enough, but the smoke is coming into the city. And there's 3 key neighborhoods in that city, each of whom elect one person from each neighborhood to go out there and figure out what's going on and how do we solve this problem. So the first man comes out looking for the solution. He is from a well-to-do part of the city, and he brings his chauffeur to drive towards the problem. Now, as he's driving, as the chauffeur is driving, they both realize that there's a decrease in visibility as they get closer to the smoke. The next man who goes out is from a densely populated area in the city, and his neighborhood strictly bikes everywhere because that's just the fastest, most efficient way to get to places. So he sets out, and he too has issues with visibility. But he's also starting to feel some issues with his breathing, so some respiratory problems. The third man is from a poorer portion of the city and doesn't have any means to any transportation. So, of course, he's feeling the visibility issues and some of the respiratory issues, but because he's on foot and he doesn't have wheels beneath him, it's taking him longer, so he's being exposed to these conditions for a much longer period of time than the other two. So eventually they're off and their paths converge. They all meet at the same point. And they can't really see each other, so they don't really know how they got there, but they all know that they're from the same city, experiencing the same heat, and experiencing the smoke from the wildfire. The one thing that they do agree on is that something absolutely needs to be done, and they are committed to getting it done. So they're continuing on this path together to this solution, to find the solution. And they hit an obstruction in the road. And this obstruction is so large, but they can't really see it, and they just want to get around it so they can continue on their mission. So they decide, all right, let's split up. We'll all kind of navigate our way to the front. We'll share what we learned, and then we'll figure out what we do next. The first man in his car weaves through and drives almost to the front until he hits a puddle. And at that puddle, he realizes, water, of course. How refreshing. I am so hot, that would quench my thirst. And it might even feel good on my skin. I'm going to open up water spouts all across the city so that people in the communities can drink water to cool down and bathe in it and recreate in it. Now, because of decreased visibility, he can't really see how wide the water is, the puddle, or how deep, but he's in a car, so he just drives right through. The second man, who's on a bike, starts some wheezing and decides, I need a break. He comes upon a pillar-like structure and realizes, this is kind of nice. Wouldn't it be great while I'm biking from place to place to sit under a nice shaded area? I'm protected from the smoke, the heat isn't as intense. This is what my city needs. The third man, again on foot, decides this smoke is causing too much issue to my breathing. I'm going to try going above it, just so I can see a little bit better. So he climbs all the way to the top of the obstruction and quickly realizes it's hotter up here. But he finally makes his way towards the front and feels this nice breeze and thinks to himself, I once heard that there's a way to capture this breeze, but I don't really know. So the three of them finally meet at the front of this obstruction, and each of them tell the others what they've learned. The first man proudly says, I have the solution for the city. We're going to open up water spouts everywhere so that people can drink cool water and they can swim in it, play in it, enjoy it. The other two men scratched their heads and said, how do you turn off those water spouts? Can you? The first man was like, I don't know. That's not a concern for me. Well, they were like, well, what if the water gets too deep? What if there's flooding? And he's like, well, we all have cars. We'll just drive through it or drive around it. No biggie. The second man says, well, I want to plant trees. That is the solution. We're going to plant more trees to provide shade, to provide shelter. And the first man says, I don't think that's going to work for me because that space is going to take up roads. And where am I going to park my car if you're going to put all these trees around? But the third man says, how do I get those trees in my neighborhood? That sounds like a pretty good idea. But of course, man number 1 and 2 ignore him. Then there's the third man who hesitantly says, there might be an opportunity to capture some of this breeze, some of this wind through technology, I've heard. But there's some issues with this because I'm not really sure about the technology, and I don't know if my neighbors are well equipped to take on running this type of technology. We're all trained in working in coal-fired power plants, but we also feel the ramifications of that smoke in addition to the heat wave, in addition to the wildfire smoke. And will those new jobs pay enough? The other two men look at this opportunity and say, you're right, it is too much for you. We'll come in and do those jobs for you. Each one of those men walk away with their version of the truth, their portion of the truth. If they just took a moment to recognize that there is a whole truth happening here, taking a moment to name what the obstruction is, and recognize that there are multiple ways to solve a problem. So there's a lot to unpack in this parable. I'm sure you all recognize it by now. But the three things I hope we take away from it is that we absolutely need to look at the bigger picture that is climate change and not the immediate problem and solve that issue at hand. And that there's various perspectives and disciplines in the game, and that we need to work together to find a multi-pronged solution. And then something that I'll touch on a little bit later too is that the potential and obvious solutions may also have some unintended consequences as we start to realize their potential. So again, my name is Surili Patel. I'm with the American Public Health Association, and here we really recognize climate change as a national priority. We hope that it will be taken up as a national priority, especially in light of all the fodder. The other thing is that we think of it as an opportunity, not just a challenge, an opportunity to rethink what our health should be and what the potential of our health as a collective can be. But the challenge is, and I hate saying this, but I say this way too frequently, climate change is blind. It is blind to our age, our race, our income, our geography, and so many other factors that make us our individual. Climate change is going to impact us all in one way or another. What the difference is that some communities will be able to bounce back from a climate event, while other communities will simply not be able to, or they might build back to that baseline level. What we need is to build stronger communities offer the care before, during, and after, and long term, so that communities can be stronger than they were before, because those climate events are going to continue to impact them and all of us over and over again and become more severe. So let's talk about it. Let's name the beast. Public perception, the common idea is that we don't want to talk about it because we don't want to talk about climate change to be impolite. We don't want to talk about it in mixed company. But if you look at this spectrum, and I know it's a little hard to read, so I'm just going to distill it, the top is the most liberal Democrat you'll find who believes climate change is happening, and the bottom is the most conservative Republican who believes climate change is happening. And if you look at it, it's not much of a variance. The middle light blue line is the general US population. Over half of the US population is primed to talk about the issue. So we need to talk about it. We need to name it. When patients come to see us, we need to be able to link climate change back to whatever health issue they're experiencing. If we're looking at the political side of things, which is one of the hindrances of us finding solutions at a national scale, climate change is way down at the bottom. This is a graph that Pew has done for many, many years, and I've been looking at it very closely since 2016. We've always been down here. So that's two different administrations, the Obama administration and the Trump administration. We're always down here at the bottom because there's this perception that there are more immediate threats than climate change. But the fact that it's up here, that means we're in the right direction. We need to somehow figure out how to politicize this issue and to talk about it in terms of what affects us all. And that includes health. Health is one of the common denominators people are willing to talk about. Why? Because there are so many faces to this climate issue that get overlooked oftentimes, and I think some of the speakers this morning so eloquently talked about it. There's the young, there's the old, there's the different, and there's the poor. With young children, we know that they consume more water and breathe in more air per body unit than the adult. So they're not just little people. We know that the elderly are often predisposed to conditions, medical conditions, or they have limited mobility. There's also an issue of social isolation. Communities of color are, let's face it, they are constantly living in a state of racism. And that's just being layered upon as we talk about different policies and strategies. And then you have climate change impacts on them. They're already disadvantaged. Low-income communities, there's this huge lack of capital investment. Infrastructure is degrading. The ability to escape a climate event becomes even more challenging when you live without resources or the means to leave. And then one invisible force is one that's going to impact us all, which is mental health. Studies have shown that climate disasters, especially extreme weather like heat or severe storms, impact communities and increase their potential mental illness from stress, PTSD, anxiety, depression. And when you see severe storms, some research has shown that there's up to 25 to 50% increase in mental illness in that community. And that's in the short term. If you're looking more long term, chronically speaking, there's 3 entry points to mental illness. One is in the acute, so wildfire or flooding may cause immediate stress, PTSD, etc. And then there's the more gradual issue, which then talks to looking at developing a chronic illness like COPD or developing an infectious disease from a weather event. And then the last one is the indirect, so there may be some infrastructure damage or degradation because of it. What we're seeing more of is mental health professionals going into communities to build psychosocial resilience in advance of an event. So that it's very important to offer services and resources immediately after or probably during, but we're talking long term. And oftentimes communities when they lack resources, it's also a cultural issue as well, where they're not thinking of mental illness or it's stigmatized. So offering communities the understanding, like a baseline understanding of what a mental illness or an episode may look like, so they can start to recognize the symptoms in themselves or in their family member, is critical, but also where to go, who to talk to. Getting other community leaders involved in this is critical in maintaining mental wellness in communities that may be hit often by climate events. This is a silly question to you guys, but why can't we solve this with a pill or a doctor's visit? That's because 80% of what it takes for us to be healthy is in the non-clinical setting. Here are some non-clinical determinants of health, if you will. Now, I come from DC. I have a stable job, knock on wood, where I know where my next paycheck is coming from. I know where I'm going to live. I have a safe and affordable home. I have access to nutritious and affordable food. I have medical care. I have insurance. All those things give me a leg up. But these things we often take for granted. It's not in every community. It's not inherent. It's not institutionalized. And this is why there are some communities that suffer more when they're hit with external factors like heat waves for a long period of time or a devastating storm in their community, because some of these structures are already not in place. And that's why it's key to not help people just rebuild, but to rebuild to be stronger, to have these non-clinical determinants institutionalized. What I'm about to do is explain very briefly why climate change infringes on our basic human rights and our civil rights, and then why it is so deeply emotional and human for us to think about climate change and be angry about it at the same time. WHO has outlined these basic human rights. This is what we strive for in every country in the world. And I'm not going to read this list to you, but you can see there is a connection between how these basic human rights are being infringed by climate events that are reoccurring, especially when we live in a society today where we're not taking action to do anything about it. Lack of action means we're actually taking action to hurt human rights. Similarly, civil rights. We've been looking at civil rights. We've been fighting for our civil rights for the last several decades, and we continue to fight for them today. And with lack of action, we're doing a disservice to all of our ancestors who came before us. As clinicians, there is power in your voice because you come from a place of privilege and understanding. Your degrees help you make the connection that climate change is real, that climate change is here, and that it's impacting your health today, and that it is going to impact and make worse the situation of health in the future. So solutions in the now. And I know this is a little bit more wonky than clinical solutions, but promoting policies, strategies, interventions in whatever work setting you're in that focus on the climate healthy choice, making it just, but also making it accessible and affordable. Not just for those who have the privilege to making these choices happen. And then it's also critical, and this meeting does a lot to advance this, is to augment the understanding of the field, the medical field, the public health field, the health field in general, and what they need in order to train and equip the field to be better messengers, to communicate more effectively about the connection between climate and health. And then influence practice from wherever you sit. We have a lot of influence. And then lead impactful action. But I have to say this, like the parable, not every solution is going to come with unintended consequences. So we have to be very careful in how we state things, how we realize things. And I have three proposed solutions for that. It's a framework in health equity that us public health wonks use very frequently. And what it does is it offers more voices to be heard. The first I want to talk about is procedural equity. And that talks about the fairness in the process. So having access to the political process or a seat at the table in the decision-making process allows more voices to be heard. So if you think back to the parable, the first man who said, or the second man who said, we need more trees, and the third man said, how do I get those in my community? They ignored him. That wasn't even an issue, he wasn't even part of the decision-making process. Distributive equity. This really focuses on not just applying an equal distribution of the benefit of a strategy, intervention, policy approach, but it also looks at how do you distribute the burden. Going back to the parable, if we looked at the first man who said, I want to do water spouts everywhere. Well, he's going to benefit. Him and his neighbors are going to benefit greatly from this. But the two communities or neighborhoods that are disadvantaged are those that don't have cars to drive around if there is flooding or escape the flooding. And that's not equitable. That solution isn't in the state it was. And then contextual recognizes that the playing field is never leveled, and it never will be. It's just a reality. Let's call it what it is. But what this does is offers the opportunity to give voice to everyone in an affected community so that they are the ones representing themselves to determine their distributive equity. I guess this is just an example of something that over 100 medical, public health, and health national organizations have come together to create and endorse. It is a call to action for the US to talk about climate, health, and equity, and it outlines 10 strategies. There are some strategies on climate that improve health. There are some strategies on health that improve climate, but the one that I am most impressed with is the strategy that focuses on financing this. It is so critical that when we talk about let's take action, let's do something, that it's not coming from other resources. We're not displacing other resources and putting it towards this, but that we need to figure out a way to finance these because it is urgent and it needs attention now. So before I leave you, and I know I'm standing between you and lunch, I just want to say again that climate change is very human, it's very emotional, and it should be. And that we have a responsibility as health care and health and public health professionals to do something about it. I told you the story up front because I recognize that imagery is very powerful because it tells a narrative and it sticks. But I also want to mention at the same time, imagery can be very superficial because anyone can change it. So it's our responsibility to make sure we know the whole truth about our patients and the communities we serve before we come up with solutions and paint an image of a problem that may have other truths to them. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we'll wait to ask questions at your panel discussion later today at 4 p.m. So thank you very much. And now we'll go for lunch, and the poster session is right outside the door. So we'll join back together again at 1:25 p.m. Thank you.